Well, hello, everyone. I'm Tyler Chrestman, and welcome to the Chrestman Conversation. Today on the podcast, we are going to talk about Joe Biden's first week in office, all the executive orders that man is out there slinging around, and all the unity that's breaking out all over the place. Because Joe Biden has said he's going to come in there and he's going to unify. And I know I certainly am feeling the unity. With all these executive orders we're going to go through today are definitely part of a unifying agenda. There's no sarcasm there. It's all unity all the time from Joe Biden and this White House. And we're going to talk about all of these, not all of them, because he signed a lot. We're not going to talk about all of them. We wouldn't have time. We'd have to do an hour-long show to talk about all of them because Joe Biden signed over 30-ish, somewhere around there, 30 executive orders in his first week in office. Now, I would just like to point out, executive orders are terrible. They're a bad idea. I was against them when Obama did them. I'm against them when Trump did them. I will be against them when Joe Biden does them. They're bad. We have a branch of government called the legislature, and Congress is supposed to be the one to legislate. They're supposed to write the laws. That's their job. It's not the job of the president to write laws, which is what an executive order is. He's just sitting down at his desk with a pen and dictating the law with the stroke of a pen. And it's a ridiculous proposition. It's not in the president's purview. And Joe Biden once said, we rewind the tape a couple years ago, that executive orders were just a way of, you don't run the country by executive order unless you're a dictator. It's something, that's a poor paraphrase, but it was something along those lines. But he made the point that executive orders are the tool of a dictator. Dictators sit at a desk and tell everyone what to do. And yet, in their first weeks in office, President Obama wrote 5 executive orders, and Donald Trump did 4. Bill Clinton and George Bush each did 0, and Joe Biden has written over 30, or at 30. We're close to 30, if not at 30. And that should tell you something right there about, again, all the unity Joe Biden is bringing to this, because executive orders are just a way to cram through stuff that you can't get parties to agree on. So let's talk about it. First up, he rejoined the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization demonstrated itself during this pandemic to be nothing but a mouthpiece for Chinese propaganda. All they were interested in doing appeared to be covering the tracks of China as we just pretended that the virus didn't escape from the lab in Wuhan. That seemed to be what they were interested in doing more than anything else, more than getting inspectors on the ground in China. What they were doing is saying, oh, China pays the bills, therefore it's probably not China's fault. Guys, they're doing a great job. They're a bad organization. They did a bad job in this pandemic, and I was glad that Donald Trump left. But we're going back in for some reason. I don't have any idea. He established the COVID-19 Health Equity Task Force. There's that terrible word, equity. And we know how much I dislike this word, because what they've done, and it's important to remember this, is they have used this word to disguise terribly radical ideology. Because people hear equity and they think equality, and they are not the same word, and they don't mean the same thing. Equality is amazing, and it's something that everyone agrees in. Equality under the law is fundamental to the United States, because it means that there are no laws that treat people differently. And that is what we should strive for and try to perfect. It's what we've spent our history trying to perfect. We got it wrong many times, but we've always strove to be better. And equity does not mean that. What equity means is, instead of equality under the law, equity means they look at a disproportionate outcome in anything, and they say it represents these two groups differently. Now, typically, right now, it's used for white and black or men and women, and they say because the outcome of this thing is different, therefore, at somewhere in the system, there's racism or sexism or some sort of ism, and that's what equity is used to disguise. Equity is used to make everyone the same at the end, which is not something that we should ever want. And if you do want that, it's because you are uneducated in history. When you try and equalize outcomes, that's when you wind up with absolutely terrible results and terrible societies. But people don't realize this, or they don't care to know this, or they think that they can do it better or differently. Equity is used to disguise radical ideology, and it is a bad thing that we are striving for. Certain parts of the country are striving for. So this racial equity task force, I'm sure, is going to be a bad move, because radicalizing an issue and viewing it through the lens of race that doesn't require a racial outcome. COVID does not require a racial lens to look through. It does not. And yet we're going to establish a COVID-19 health equity task force for no reason. This is divisive. It's so divisive, and it's totally unnecessary. Joe Biden signed an executive order to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. So apparently, the fact that every economist in the world and all the data that we've ever done shows that one thing is guaranteed to happen when you raise the minimum wage, and that is that unemployment goes up. It's apparently unimportant. No one cares. This is a terrible idea, and it's a terrible idea coming in the midst of the worst economic crisis our country has faced in, I don't know, a century. The one thing that we do not need when we've just had over 100,000 small businesses close for good is mandating that the rest of them pay their workforce more than the market dictates. If you think that this is a good idea, again, just listen to what I said. 100,000 businesses have closed permanently in the past year. And now we're going to tell the rest of the small businesses they have to pay their employees more than they were paying them. Now, again, there's a lot in economics we could go in to talk about all the reasons why this is bad, but let's just focus on one right now. Every time you raise the minimum wage, your unemployment levels grow. Now, we have a record unemployment in this country right now, and we're going to raise the minimum wage, which means that our unemployment numbers are going to go up more. Again, a bad idea, not dictated by any good data. This is just because activists have said $15 an hour is a good thing. It is not. It's not a good idea. But Joe Biden has a pen and a desk and 100,000 small businesses closing. You know what? Let's add a few more. Let's add some more people to the unemployment rolls by raising the minimum wage. Super idea. Joe Biden signed an executive order, placed a moratorium on oil and gas leases, and he canceled the Keystone Pipeline. Now this, day one he did this. This amounts to tens of thousands of union jobs that were gone right there. Just like that. Blink of an eye, snap of a finger, 10,000 union jobs gone. Why did he do that? It's hilarious to me. I have seen people putting together tweets from unions pre-election that endorsed Joe Biden and said he's going to do great things for the working man, blah, blah, blah. And then on the right side of the screen, it's their tweet right after his day one when they said, I can't believe Joe Biden would do this and cost all these union jobs. You can't believe it? This is a terrible idea. This pissed off, by the way, handsome Bernie Sanders up north, Justin Trudeau. This made him upset. He said, this is a bad idea from the U.S. Now, if you're too extreme for Justin Trudeau in Canada, you're clearly implementing bad policy. The Keystone Pipeline is safe. It is environmentally friendly. It is not a bad thing. So instead, what we're going to do, instead of importing oil through the Keystone Pipeline, what we're going to do is we're going to import oil from Russia and Saudi Arabia again. And instead of being energy independent, we'll ship the oil in big transport containers across an ocean to bring it to the U.S. because we're not going to lessen our production of oil or our increased need for oil by canceling the Keystone Pipeline. All we're going to do is lengthen the supply chain, which is actually less environmentally friendly than the Keystone Pipeline itself. People who are against the Keystone Pipeline have never taken a moment to educate themselves on the impact it's going to have on climate change. This is something that is clearly just for the activists. There is no good science that says this makes an iota of difference to any sort of climate change models. Trying to give up the U.S.'s energy independence day one. Again, canceling oil and gas leases and the Keystone Pipeline. All this is doing is making us dependent on our ideological enemies for oil. Now, we learned that in the terms of PPE, this is a bad idea. We shouldn't be relying on China for personal protective equipment in a pandemic because when we needed masks, we couldn't get enough masks. Well, why should we rely on Russia and in the Middle East to supply us with oil, which drives the entire economy? Tell me how this makes sense. It doesn't. It doesn't make sense. And yet, we're going to do it. Day one, we're out. Union jobs gone. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think Joe Biden set a record for the number of jobs cost in day one of an administration because he canceled the oil and gas leases, the Keystone Pipeline, and we'll get into some more things he did in just a minute, but let's talk about this real quick just because we were talking about climate change. He's back in the Paris Climate Accords. Now, forget for a moment that the Paris Climate Accords are a useless, non-binding agreement that will do nothing to stop the rise in the global temperature in the next 100 years. They will do nothing because the Paris Climate Accords do not hold the world's biggest polluters to account, mainly China and India. China and India can do whatever the hell they want. It's a non-binding agreement, and they will continue to do what they want. Now, it's hard as an industrialized first world nation to look at a place like India that is currently going through what amounts to an industrial revolution and saying, oh my gosh, you guys are so bad, quit doing that, when we did it, 100 years ago. It's hard for us to say you're not allowed to do that. You can't industrialize the way we did to become a world power because now climate change is bad. And 100 years ago, we didn't know that when we did it, so it was fine. It's hard for us to say that. These Paris Climate Accords don't do anything. They're not going to make an iota of difference in the global temperature in the next 100 years. They are a meaningless gesture that does nothing. And, by the way, the United States was already, if I'm not mistaken about this, and I don't believe I am, the United States was already meeting its quota without being in the Paris Climate Accords. We were already meeting our obligation to this thing that we were treating. Joe Biden's going to treat it like a treaty, but it's not a treaty. It's a non-binding agreement that has no legislative power behind it whatsoever. They can't impose any fines or they can't impose anything on us if we don't follow it. It's non-binding. It's not a legislative thing. It's not a treaty. It's just a meaningless gesture, which is what most of these amounted to, these executive orders. Now, let's talk more about those union jobs that Joe Biden is just happy to throw away. By the way, when asked about the union jobs, John Kerry basically told him to learn to code. He said, we're going to have different jobs for different people, and those people should have made better choices about their career paths. He's basically saying learn to code. That's what the press secretary, too, I can't remember her name, the new one, she basically said, too, those guys are going to be able to find different jobs. With record levels of unemployment, I would love for you to point out the jobs that those people are going to be able to just find. What a tone-deaf thing to say from this administration. And more about putting the boot to the neck of the American worker. We're going to talk about immigration. He's going to return federal dollars to sanctuary cities. This one really pissed me off. He's counting illegal immigrants on the census. The census is used to draw congressional districts and proportion representation in Congress. So you're using non-citizens who can't vote and do not pay taxes to proportion representation in Congress. So let's just make an extreme example. They say we have 11 million illegal immigrants. Now that number is obviously a lot higher. Imagine for 1 second that all 11 million of them lived in California. Now I realize that they're spread out throughout mostly the West and Southwest, but imagine for a second that all 11 million of them lived in California. Now that gives California a population of 50 million instead of 40 million. And what does that mean? That means that the proportion of congressional seats that get distributed to California grows, which means that California's power in Congress grows. And that's not okay. It's not okay for non-citizens to be counted on the census in terms of representation in government. Because again, these people are non-voting, non-tax-paying citizens. This is the equivalent. This was the argument, by the way, in principle. And I'm going to it might be a poor analogy, but it is true. This is the example when the northern states and the southern states got into an argument over the Three-Fifths Compromise, where the North said to the South, you are not allowed to count black people as people and proportion them on the census when you treat them like property. That is not okay. And the South said, no, they're people when we want them to be people, and they're property when we want them to be property, and they should be counted on the census. And this would have proportioned the representation in the South higher because they had a lot of black people in the South, but they were slaves. They weren't considered people. And the North said that's not okay. And the North was 100% right. You do not get to count non-people on the census. Now, this is obviously a different analogy when you're talking about Hispanics. Hispanics are people, but they're non-voting people. And so unless the Democrats' plan is to legalize them and grant them citizenship, they shouldn't be represented in our Congress. Now, that is the Democrats' plan. They're just not saying it out loud just yet. But they want to say, well, we're going to count them, we're going to proportion their vote, and then we're going to grant them citizenship. That amnesty plan is coming. You watch. This is the first step of the plan by the Biden administration to just let all the people in this country illegally vote. And they're only interested in doing that because they tend to vote Democrat. Again, that was changed in the last election a little bit, but still not great. And not a great thing for our country. Oh, and the other thing about I was getting ready to talk about this, the jobs that Joe Biden is costing people immediately. He halted construction on the border wall. Now, again, this is just another meaningless, ridiculous gesture. The border wall, 400 miles of it have been constructed under the Trump administration. The border wall is a good idea. It is. It is not. It's not racist to have a barrier and say we should control the flow of people in and out of our country. How this became a racism issue is insane. If we had a problem with Canadians sneaking over the border, I would want a border wall with Canada too, a giant border wall where they couldn't get in illegally. We have a problem on our southern border. Everyone acknowledges this. Everyone knows it. And yet, for some reason, saying anything about it and wanting to police the border is racist, as if it's because we don't want Mexicans to come into the country. Please, come in legally. If you want to come to the United States, I am all for legal immigration. We need a lot of it. It's great. I think immigrants are wonderful. I do not want illegal immigrants to come into the country. There is nothing racial about that. And the idea that it is racist to want a border wall is just asinine. It is crazy, and it is a terrible argument. And also, this is going to cost more jobs because, obviously, construction jobs on the southern border are no longer available because he canceled the funding. It was going to cost, they estimated, $10 billion to build the border wall. That sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. Day one, Joe Biden's stimulus plan called for $1.9 trillion. So I don't want to hear about $10 billion being a lot of money from anyone who's okay with $1.9 trillion just being thrown out there after we just did another $1 trillion spending deal. It's just ridiculous. I'm all worked up, in case you can't tell. So the next one, we're moving on. The Joe Biden is signing a bill to protect gender identity discrimination. Now, should people discriminate against people? We're not going to get into the technicalities of the Thomas Sowell levels of discrimination, but we're going to say no because most people hear the word discrimination and think it's inherently bad. Should we be, let's use a different word. Should we be prejudiced? No, we shouldn't be prejudiced against people. That one is very clear. Protecting against gender identity discrimination and signing an executive order about it is not a great idea because this one is different than inherently immutable characteristics. So, saying you can't discriminate based on race or gender is a good idea. Saying you can't discriminate, you could even throw a couple other things in there, like religion or sexual orientation. Now, again, those two are different because religion is technically a choice, but we don't treat it like a choice. And people, this is going to be a controversial statement, but so is sexual identity. Now, it is inherent in it has a strong biological component. So you're born straight, you're born with homosexual tendencies, but the actual action of being gay is a choice you can make, acting on your sexual desires. Now, again, I don't put a lot of weight in that argument, but it is technically in that same category. But I would group sexual orientation in the same category as immutable characteristics. Gender identity is where you run into a problem because it is, according to people on the left, it is very fluid and can change daily. So how can you not discriminate based on gender identity? Let's use an obvious example. Let's say I hire you as a woman, you identify as a woman, to work at my Hooters restaurant, and the next day you come in and say, well, now I identify as a man, you can't fire me because it's discrimination. But you're not actually here for the job that I hired you for, which is to parade around and be a sexy woman serving food. So I have some issues with that because if it's malleable, if it's a choice that you're making, and according to people on the left, gender identity is a choice that can change daily. It is something that is constantly ever evolving. That makes it very difficult for I see this being abused, and I see this being the fodder for a lot of frivolous lawsuits that are just bad. He signed an executive order reversing the Trump transgender military ban. Now, the Trump military ban did not actually ban transgender people from serving in the military. It did two things it basically said, if you were transgender, and let's say you decided you were transgender while in the military, you had to finish your term being treated as the sex that you enlisted as. And the other part of it was you were not allowed to get gender reassignment surgery while in the military. I didn't think that was an unfair rule because, again, the military is a giant bureaucracy. And one of the things that, again, this is a problem that affects next to no one. The amount of transgender people in the country is less than 1%. It's incredibly small. So this was more just it's more just a thing you can hold up and say, we don't want discrimination against transgender people because we love everybody. It doesn't really do anything. It's not affecting a ton of people, the one person. But here was the thing that was actually a problem. Imagine that I'm a man, I join the military, and I decide I'm actually transgender. I want to be a female. Having a gender reassignment surgery is not a minor surgery. And if you were doing that while you're in a 4-year contract with the military, then that takes you out of commission from being able to be deployed, from being in all sorts. It takes you out of commission for an extended period in that contract. So the fear was that people could abuse this and have this incredibly invasive surgery in the midst of their contract and essentially get out of 2 years of being eligible for deployment or anything like that. So again, I don't think people were doing that necessarily. I don't know if there's anyone who's done that in the military. I'm sure there's probably a few isolated cases, but it wasn't a big deal either way. It's just, it's just one of those things that you're signing a meaningless bill. It's not affecting people, not really. The executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities throughout the federal government. This is a reintroduction of critical race theory into the government. Bad news. The critical race theory is it's too much to dissect right now, but it is a terrible philosophy of thought that has popped up into prevalence in the last 20, 30 years, and recently in the last 3-4 years has become very popular in the farther reaches of the left, but it is encroaching towards the center of the left as well. And this is a giant problem. I don't have time to dissect all of critical race theory right here, but again, all we have to do is read the phrase racial equity to understand what this means. Here's a good summary of critical race theory. Critical race theory is basically the idea that discrimination in the past can only be made up for with discrimination in the present. That is a good summation of critical race theory in a nutshell. It is the idea that we have to correct for past injustices with modern day injustices. Now, it wouldn't be phrased like that, but that is what it means. It means discriminating against people today because historically they discriminated against other people in the past, and we have to equalize that. So there's a disparity between white and black because of past historical discrimination. Well, the way to fix that today is to discriminate against those in power, which in this case would be white people. And by discriminating against them, we'll equalize the outcome. We'll get that equity, that racial equity. And therefore, whenever we achieve that utopian vision of everyone's equal in all categories, then we can stop. It's a bad idea all around. This week, these executive orders have demonstrated the priorities of the Biden administration. They are not values and priorities that I think are very unifying at all. I think that a lot of this was incredibly radical policy that he's pushing day one. His climate change policy, his immigration policy is clearly very radical. They're stopping all deportations. They're stopping everything. Sanctuary cities are back. The border walls being done. Illegal immigrants are going to be on the census. Immigration, climate change, the racial politics, the transgender stuff, all of this stuff is not a unifying agenda. This is not just let's tackle COVID together and unify. Let's heal the nation from the terrible rift that has grown in the last 10 years. I want Joe Biden to be a unifying president, but this is clearly the fear that those of us in the center and on the right had, which is that Joe Biden is not a moderate anymore. He does not have the pull to be a moderate. They are presenting Joe Biden as a moderate. This policy is not moderate. It's not. It's not at all. And the Democratic Party thinks that because you put Joe Biden up there and say, of all of our primary candidates, he was the moderate one. Therefore, we're really just the center left trying to make everyone better. This is not center left policy. It's far left policy. And they're using Joe Biden to mask it. And the media is going to be complicit in that. They are going to pretend that Joe Biden is totally fine and that all of this is great. And he's just a unifying president out there unifying. He's bringing us together. He's healing the soul of the nation, Joe Biden. And no, he's not. I hope he does. I hope he works, and I hope all his policy works out really well for America. But I don't see it right now. Oh, Lord. Anyway, this is a long one. There's a lot to cover. You know why? Because he signed 30 executive orders in his first week. That's why. It takes us a long time to go through them. Because he signed 30 executive orders in his first week. By contrast, when you average the amount that Donald Trump and Obama did, it was less than one a week during their presidency. 30. Let's just remember that. Dictator in chief. Okay, we're leaving it there today. People, I'm Tyler Chrestman. I hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you did, make sure to like, subscribe, share it, pass it around. Tell your friend, tell your neighbor, tell your mom, tell your dog. Get people out there sharing it. I love it. And I will talk to you guys later this week. Hope you have a great day.